Hello and welcome to another pen video from me, Penultimate Dave. So I have here another inks comparison video, and this is Orange Inks comparison number 3. So I think with that, let's go and swap up some of these inks. So I get a lot of questions on how I do these ink videos. So I decided I would add this to the front of each of the ink videos. I put links in the description, but I know some of you watch this on TVs or mobile devices, so you don't get to see this. So first off, the paper is the number one question I get asked. What paper do I use for these ink comparison videos? So this is the original Tomoe River. This is 52 GSM, and it is the white, not the cream, the white. Where possible, I try to go for the white because the cream can actually change the color of the ink just a little bit. So this is Tomoe River 52 GSM in the white. A lot of people get confused as well because I have what looks to be a grid on this page, and it's actually an Oxford Optik pad. These are the pads that I actually use when I'm writing my writing samples for pen reviews or in my currently ink. So they have these little squares up here. I just use that because it's a good guide for me when I put this very thin sheet of Tomoe River over. I can actually see squares, so it helps me write a little bit sort of straight on the page. Not always, but sometimes it does. The other thing that I also have is I have a bottle of water, plain water, and I dip my nib in here. So for consistency, I use the same fountain pen, or I guess it's not a fountain pen, it's using a fountain pen nib though. This is a 3D printed pen from William Shakour in the UK. So he prints this material 3D, and it has a number 8 size Bock nib which I can unscrew, and you can see there. So it is just a dip pen holder for a number 8 size Bock nib, and the idea is I want to have consistency with the writing sample. So I use this, I dip it in the ink, I write, and then I will dip it in here and I will rinse the nib off several times and I will dry it, and then at that point I will then go on to do the next ink swatch and the next writing sample. So there you have it. That's how I do my ink swatches. So I just wanted to show you that here. Now on to the ink comparison video. So the first ink here is Noodlers Apache Sunset. So we'll do an ink swatch here, and this is a beautiful ink. If you like an orange ink that shades really well, then this definitely is the ink for you because this has a huge amount of shading. We'll do a second pass over the top here, at the top half of this ink swatch, just to show the difference between a wet or a broader nib and a dry or a narrow nib, and also to see if we see any shading, and in some cases sheen as well. So this is Noodlers Apache Sunset. Now, one thing that I should mention about Noodlers inks is that Nathan Tardif does actually change the ink colours slightly between batches of ink. So this is a really old, I say really old, this is a 5-year-old bottle of ink. So every year this colour will change a bit. Now, from what I've seen, Apache Sunset doesn't change a huge amount, but other Noodlers inks do. So just bear that in mind if you are buying any Noodlers inks. The next ink here is Herbin, and it's Orange Indien. So we'll do an ink swatch here. And this is an ink that I'd actually bought, one of my very early inks in this hobby, and I still haven't used this bottle, unfortunately. We'll do a second pass over the top half here, just to show the difference between a wet and a dry writing nib. And the reason why I haven't used it is I wasn't a great fan of this orange. I found it wrote a little bit dry. I find a lot of Herbin inks do write a little bit more on the drier side. So this is Herbin, and it is orange, and it's Indian. But of course, I'm actually writing with a very, very super wet nib here, so that doesn't really matter too much. But if you were trying to write with this, say, in a fine or an extra fine nib, or maybe even in a Joro nib, then you might then see that it's a little bit on the dry side. The next ink here is Sailor, and this is a gentle ink, and it's Kin-Mokusei. So we'll do an ink swatch. And this, I have to say, is my favorite orange ink. It really is a beautiful, beautiful orange. Well, I say favorite. My ultimate favorite is actually Sailor Gentle Apricot or Apricot. We'll do a second pass over the top here just to show the difference between a wet and a dry, or a broad and a narrow writing nib. The problem is that you cannot get Sailor Gentle Apricot anymore. And you can still get Kin-Mokusei. So Kin-Mokusei is the next best. So this is Sailor Gentle, and it's Kin-Mokusei. And there really isn't a lot of difference between the two inks. I'd say, if anything, maybe Sailor Gentle Apricot probably has a slight amount more sheen to it, or a tendency to sheen, whereas Kin-Mokusei maybe not so much. The next ink here is Diamine Blaze Orange. Now this was my first #1 favourite ink before Sailor Gentle Apricot or Kin-Mokusei. So we'll do an ink swatch here, and Blaze Orange is a really beautiful, bright, punchy orange. So this is one that I do still like a lot. We'll do a second pass over the top just to show again the difference between a wetter or a broader nib and a finer or a drier nib. So this is Diamine, and it's Blaze Orange. But I do think it actually lives up to its name. The next ink here is Diamine Pumpkin. So we'll do an ink swatch. And again, although this is a newer orange ink, at least to me, I am starting to like this ink a lot. And I think this could also become a bit of a favourite as well. We'll do a second pass over the top half of the swatch, and that will show the broad or wet versus a narrow or dry writing nib. And this is Diamine, and it's Pumpkin. And I'd have to say, we'll have to see once this has dried, but I would say that that is possibly a lighter shade of Diamine Blaze Orange. And then the last ink here is Diamine Vermillion. We'll do an ink swatch here. Now, Vermilion can be a reddish or an orangish colour ink, so I'm going to add it to the mix here. We'll do a second pass over the top half, and then we can show the difference between a broad or wet and a narrow or dry writing nib. And this is Diamine, and it is Vermilion. But that also is quite a nice colour, a little bit more on the darker side, I would say. So I think now let's take a look at these inks in a little bit more detail now that the inks have dried. So the first ink here is Noodlers Apache Sunset, and this is a really good orange ink. It has a huge amount of shading. So if you have got a a broader nib that typically would shade better than a maybe an extra fine or a fine nib, you are going to see a lot of shading going on there. Now, this is a wet writing nib. You can definitely see the difference between a wet and a dry. You can see a lot of shading going on there. Now, it is still slightly wet. Apache Sunset does take a long time to dry. I don't see any sheen on there, but there is certainly shading. The writing sample looks quite nice as well. The next ink here is Herbin, and it's Orange Indian. Now, it's quite difficult to see the difference between a wet and a dry writing nib. It pretty much holds its colour throughout. So you're going to see the same colour pretty much on a broad or a narrow writing nib. There is some shading going on around the pulled areas. I think if we take a look at this in a little bit more detail, you can see that there. Again, there is no sheen there, but it's quite a nice coloured orange ink. The next ink here is one of my favourites, and it's Sailor Gentle Kin-Mokusei. I do still actually have probably about 1.5 bottles left of Sailor Gentle Apricot, and I typically don't write with it because I managed to pick up 5 bottles of Sailor Gentle Kin-Mokusei afterwards, and I do need to get back to writing with Gentle Apricot, but there really isn't a huge difference between the two. I'd say Apricot does sheen a little bit more. You can definitely see a difference between a wet versus a dry writing nib. You can see the writing sample is quite a wet writing sample, but if I show you here in a little bit more detail, you will see sheen, and there is sheen around the edges of that pulled area of ink. It's quite a nice sheen, and there is a little bit of sheen, I would say, on the dry as well. So you can get sheen out of Sailor Gentle Kin-Mokusei. If you have an ink like this that is trying to sheen, just not as much as you would like it, ink it up in a converter in a pen. Let that pen sit for a few weeks or possibly a month, and then start writing with it, because a little bit of water out of the ink would have evaporated. It will have made that ink a little bit more thicker, a little bit more viscous, and that will accentuate any sheen that you get. The next ink here is Diamine Blaze Orange, which from early on when I started buying ink was my favourite orange ink. And I've gone through, I want to think 4. I bought 4 bottles. I've got 2 remaining. So I've gone through a couple of bottles. It's a really lovely ink. So you can see not a lot of difference between a wet versus a dry writing nib. There is a lot of shading going on. The writing sample is quite dark as well. If I show a little bit more detail here close up, there isn't any sheen on this ink, but there is a fair amount of shading going on there. So that's actually quite a nice bright orange ink. The next ink is Diamine Pumpkin, and I have to say this is actually starting to wow me a little bit more. This is an ink that I have not looked at really before until recently. You can see a huge difference between a wet and a dry writing nib here. The writing sample is a wet writing sample. There is a little bit of shading, but not a huge amount. If I show it up close there, there isn't any sheen either, but it's a nice, bright, punchy, orange coloured ink. And then the last ink here is Diamine Vermillion. Now, is this an orange? Is it a red? It's a little bit debatable, I would say, but I thought I would add that one in here anyway. There is a huge difference between a wet and a dry writing nib. This is a wet writing nib, so you're seeing that darker colour there. There is a fair amount of shading going on there. You can certainly see it around the pulled areas of ink. Is there any sheen? No, there is not. I think maybe there's a slight amount there, but it really isn't anything to sort of talk out about. So I think really it's not an ink that is going to sheen massively. If anything, Sailor Gentle Kin-Mokusei or maybe Sailor Gentle Apricot would be a better sheening ink if you wanted a sheening ink. So there you have it. That's my orange inks comparison number 3 video. If you like any of these inks, do let me know in the comments below. Likewise, if you have other similar inks to these, or there are other orange inks you'd like to have compared, then do let me know in the comments below. So this is orange inks comparison number 3. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next pen video. Bye bye.